Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 501. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. Happy to have you back on the show today. This is actually a bonus episode because we've had just so much to talk about this week, and we got an incredible amount more news to get through. So, Connor, let's just get into it after reminding the audience they can find the show at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. And then, of course, you can follow myself and Connor on Twitter. I am at Kyle _. And Connor, you are
at Freeman's Mind 96.
All right. Thank you, Connor. And let's get into today's episode. The first story I had to mention here is a story from NBC News. They got a report from the Department of Veteran Affairs on veteran suicide in 2021. That report found that 6,390 former service members took their lives in 2021. Typically, Connor, the rate reported by the VA is an undercount, but that's what they say. That comes out to about 17 and a half veterans killing themselves every day. So this is still slightly down from the peak, although this is up from 2020. So it was going up the past year. And this is interesting because female veteran suicides grew by about 24%, which I'm guessing is still a fairly large number compared to the males, but the male suicide rate was only up 6%. So there is that, and of course that's a legacy of all of our wars that we fight all the time. Next up here is an article by Ken Silva at the Libertarian Institute. Hitman recruited to target John Bolton was an FBI informant. Connor, are you surprised by this? I'm very surprised. In August of 2022, the Justice Department announced that the FBI had foiled an Iranian plot to assassinate former National Security Advisor John Bolton in retaliation for the U.S. killing Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Commander Qasem Soleimani. But the hitman hired to target John Bolton was an FBI informant. This was reported Sunday by 60 Minutes, which glossed over that fact and treated Bolton assassination plot as legitimate. Lucky for Bolton, the assassin was an FBI informant, the news show reported, painting the assassination plot as a legitimate threat. However, the Department of Justice charging papers show that the plot was largely contrived and that Bolton was never in actual danger. Moreover, the Department of Justice has claimed that the man who tried hiring the FBI informant was a member of Iran's IRG Quds Force, but charging papers show that investigators never confirmed that. And so, Connor, very unsurprising here that this alleged plot turns up pretty empty in reality. Next, I want to do a quick update on the Biden-Xi meeting that happened in San Francisco this week. Biden has productive discussion with Xi, then slams Chinese leader as a dictator. So Joe Biden met with the Chinese president Xi Jinping in talks in San Francisco. Beijing and Washington described the conversations between the leaders as productive and important. After the summit, Biden called his Chinese counterpart a dictator. During the summit between Biden and Xi, the leaders agreed to resume military-to-military communications once China appoints a new defense minister. The former Chinese defense minister had not spoken with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin because he was under sanctions by Washington. The leaders agreed to attempt to curb fentanyl trafficking as well. Biden described the talks as some of the most constructive and productive discussions we've had. He added that Xi will be willing to pick up the phone in the future. A press release from the Chinese Foreign Ministry said the summit was positive, comprehensive, and constructive, and it charted the course for improving development between U.S. and China relations. It added that San Francisco should be a new starting point for stabilizing the China-U.S. relationship. She told Biden that there were two paths forward for Washington-Beijing relationship. According to the foreign ministry, she noted that China and the U.S. face two options in the era of global transformation unseen in a century. One is to enhance solidarity and cooperation and join hands to meet global challenges and promote global security and prosperity. And the other is to cling to zero sum mentality, provoke rivalry and confrontation, and drive the world towards turmoil and division. The Chinese press relief added that the two choices point to two different directions that will decide the future of humanity and the planet. Both Biden and Xi acknowledged that the U.S. Chinese relationship is the most important one on the planet. While Biden focused on increasing increasing communications and curbing fentanyl trafficking, she stressed to the American president the importance of the Taiwan issue. In the Foreign Ministry press release, she explained China's principal position on the Taiwan issue. She pointed out that the Taiwan question remains the most important and most sensitive issue in the U.S. China relationship. The U.S. side should take real actions to honor its commitment to not supporting Taiwanese independence, to stop arming Taiwan, and to support China's peaceful reunification. China will realize reunification, and this is unstoppable. Since taking office, Biden has increased U.S. ties with Taiwan. Biden has deployed U.S. soldiers to the island and increased weapon sales to Taipei. In an overture to show Beijing's commitment to a new relationship moving forward, she said China would send more pandas to the U.S. And Connor, this sounds really stupid, but there's a particularly dim-witted senator who was very concerned about China taking 3 of their pandas out of the Smithsonian Zoo. And this hoodie-wearing senator was making a really big deal about how China had no right to do this. For people who don't know, from Beijing's perspective, the panda represents China. And so, the health of the panda and the species is representative of China in a way. And so not only do they spend a lot of money within China and making sure they're breeding and the pandas there are healthy, but they also really work around the world to make sure that pandas that are held in zoos of other countries are kept in conditions that Beijing is okay with. And in the past, they have worked very hard to recall pandas, particularly from other Asian countries, when they felt like those pandas were not being kept in very good conditions. I believe Malaysia was one of the countries that had their pandas taken. So she said the pandas will deepen the friendly ties between our two peoples. And he also made some remarks, Connor, about how after talking to some American children, he understood how important the pandas are. In another little bit of some positivity that came out of this relationship, there is a picture with the Chinese president with the biggest smile I have ever seen. He's standing there with Gavin Newsom, and Newsom is giving him a basketball jersey. And so I know that, basketball is pretty big in China. The NBA works on a lot of outreach there. And so, you hope these kind of things can really start to build some positivity, because we got to get to the problem here, and that's Joe Biden. In a press conference after the summit, Biden slammed the Chinese president as a dictator. In response to a reporter asking the president if he thought his Chinese counterpart was a dictator, Biden said to Xi, I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he's a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that is based on a form of government totally different than our own. He said, anyways, we made progress. And the blunder is unbelievable. And for anybody who hasn't seen it, there's a couple videos of Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, as Biden saying this. Now, in the video that's zoomed a little bit out, it's kind of hard to tell what Blinken might be thinking, but there's a pretty good tight-in shot on his face, and he visibly winces when Biden calls Xi a dictator. And so that there were meetings with Biden on how to answer this question, and he still got it wrong.
You can see him as the questions being asked, where he's just like, oh God, come on, please get it right. And then when it happens, you could see the visible pain, like he said. And if this remains successful, even in spite of that blunder, this is the best thing Blinken ever did his whole life, is especially helping the U.S. climb down from the level of tensions with China to the point they were up until this conference, up until this meeting in San Francisco. Yeah, so I can empathize with them on that level.
And Connor, I do want to say here that the Chinese seem content on downplaying the incident. Mao Ning, a Chinese government spokesperson, said China strongly opposes the dictator accusation, but added it should be pointed out that there will always be some people with ulterior motives who attempt to incite damage of the U.S.-China relations, and they are doomed to fail. And I don't think that she was referring to Biden there. I think she was referring to the journalist who asked the question, that it was, meant to be provocative and meant to trap Biden into saying something stupid like this. And look, if this was a North Korea issue, I think there would be a lot more tensions created by this comment. But I don't think that the Chinese are quite so fragile. And a part of that probably comes with China's a very powerful country. And, when you're big and tough and could actually fight, it matters a lot less when people fling insults at you. Now, one more piece of good news, Connor. The U.S. removed the Chinese Foreign Ministry of Public Security Institute of Forensic Science from the sanctions list. Washington dropped the sanctions as a part of an agreement to curb fentanyl trafficking. Biden and Xi made the deal during a face-to-face meeting in San Francisco. So good to see there is some progress coming out of there. Want to switch gears and talk about the U.S.-Russia relationship a little bit. The Turkish Parliament's Foreign Affairs Commission has delayed a vote on Sweden's NATO membership bid. The chairman of that commission will hold further talks and may bring the bill back on its agenda next week, but he did not set a clear timeline. The Turkish President Erdogan said this month that he would try to facilitate the ratification vote, but added that Sweden has not taken enough action on Kurdish armed groups. And Connor, Erdogan's party does control the legislature, so if he wanted this to happen, I'm sure it would be. This is I think a signal that Ankara is actually trying to hold up Sweden's NATO membership bid until, I guess, Sweden makes more concessions. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you. I know you wrote a great article on U.S. sanctions on Russia oil yesterday for antiwar.com.
Absolutely. So this article is about some sanctions that the U.S. imposed this week. The Treasury Department levied against firms and ships that are in violation or accused of being in violation of the price cap on Russian oil that was imposed by the U.S. and the Group of Seven Nations last December, the $60 per barrel price cap on Russian oil, which is meant to deprive Russia of the resources and funding it needs for its war effort against Ukraine. And for a number of reasons, of course, that's been a miserable failure. So let's get into this. So the way I wrote this for antiwar.com last night. So this is on Thursday, the U.S. Treasury Department imposed a set of new sanctions on ships and companies accused of using American service providers to ship Russian crude oil above the $60 price cap. So the price cap, which as I said, was imposed by the U.S. and the G7 last December, was meant to deprive the Kremlin of funds for its war effort. Now, the three firms that were sanctioned were based in the United Arab Emirates, and then 3 ships were blacklisted from transferring oil and other products with U.S. service providers. And they're also, not allowed to do business with Americans, et cetera, et cetera. And so last month, the Treasury issued its first sanctions over these violations and notified shipping management firms in more than 30 countries that Washington is seeking information regarding 100 vessels that it believes are dodging sanctions. So this is the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Wally Adeyemo, who says, quote, "We are committed to maintaining market stability in spite of Russia's war against Ukraine, while cutting into the profits the Kremlin is using to fund its illegal war and remaining unyielding in our pursuit of those facilitating evasion of the price cap." So it's been almost a year since the price cap was implemented, and Moscow has seen a, quote, almost complete export volume recovery in oil. And this is according to Chris Wafer, the chief executive officer of strategic consultants Marco Advisory Ltd., who was speaking to Newsweek. So he continues highlighting that Russia shipped 3.5 million barrels of crude per day last month via tankers, along with an additional 1.2 million barrels per day through the East Siberia pipeline. And in August, Russia was selling oil at an average price of $74 per barrel. Wafer also notes that Russia has seen further gains as a result of the Brent crude price increasing from $70 to $95 per barrel between July and September of this year. So in response to the sanctions and the price cap, the Kremlin has continued looking east and selling its oil to non-sanctioning countries. And so just like it did that after the war and the sanctions blitz was initiated last year, they've continued to do so after following the price cap being implemented late last year. So Moscow, of course, since last year has become the top crude supplier to India and China. And Russia has also been using a shadow fleet of vessels to circumvent Western economic penalties. So Wafer says Washington and the G7 expected to be dealing with the, quote, old tanker market structure, assuming that Russia would be using a few very big tanker operators with large fleets that would have been easy to monitor and enforce. However, he says, quote, what has emerged is a greatly dispersed fleet ownership with the flexibility to disappear and reappear with a new name faster than the G7 and EU can catch them. And there's talk now about getting Denmark. It's just sort of rumors in these articles that the EU may be looking at getting Denmark to stop these ships and inspect them somewhat under the pretext that these are older ships and thus environmental hazards for a number of reasons. And the idea that this could just lead to ultimately a confrontation on the seas between the West and Russia. But there's nothing for sure yet about that. But so at any rate, the point about the policy overall is that Washington and NATO's proxy war with Russia and Ukraine has been a disaster. As Eurocom Chief General Christopher Cavoli explained to Congress earlier this year, Russia's Navy and Air Force have taken negligible losses, and its ground forces are bigger today, that's a quote, than when the war began. The Pentagon is depleting its own weapons stocks to support Kiev's failing war effort, while Russia's capacity to produce armor and ammo has outstripped the entire NATO alliance. So Ukraine has lost 20% of its country, approximately at this point. The Kremlin has gained more territory than Kiev this year, and Ukrainian forces are estimated to have suffered tens of thousands of casualties during recent months. And the long-awaited counteroffensive, which was launched, even though Western military officials knew damn well that the Ukraine was ill prepared for the operation and lacked the troops and military equipment and ammunition that they needed in order to pull it off. And so it's been an absolute slaughter for the Ukrainians. And of course, despite all this, the White House continues to seek funding for the war. They want to spend an additional $60 billion on funding the proxy war through the next year's presidential election. It's not exactly clear to me that that's going to happen yet. I'm confident that Congress will support it, but it just seems like the appetite is much more in favor of funding the war in Gaza than even these policies in Eastern Europe and East Asia right now. And the Ukraine war has become so unpopular that it might be a good opportunity, if the Democrats are smart, if Biden and the White House are smart, to just try and negotiate or lean hard on Kiev, even if Zelensky won't go along. Maybe they can get somebody else one way or another and negotiate a ceasefire and a truce. And of course, Ukraine is going to have to give up a lot of its territory in order to make a deal. I don't think Russia will accept anything less, but now would be if we have any responsible people in leadership at this point, which is more than doubtful, then I think right now would be the opportunity the time to try and make that happen. But of course, that is officially, from everything we can see, Biden wants to continue that war through the election. And so in September, just to point out once again how the sanctions have just not worked, Russia's finance ministry published a document explaining that Moscow intends to ramp up defense spending by 68% to $111.15 billion next year. And much of that has come from increased oil revenues. In fact, I linked to an article about that, how they had a change to their budget rule, opened up just under, I believe, $20 billion in additional funding as well as a result of some increased revenues that they're seeing here with the energy sales that is going to help fund that. And just again, it's still it's the American military budget still dwarfs Russia's defense budget here. But of course, as we're just pointing out, I mean, they had the whole NATO alliance was backing this proxy war with Ukraine, and they have depleted their own weapon stocks, and Ukraine has still lost. And Russia has time on their side. They're winning the war, and it's they can continue to try and impose these sanctions all they want, but the fact is they've sanctioned so many countries that we're seeing so many more countries lining up to join BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And there's just, these countries that have been through these economic wars of the United States, especially under Biden and Trump, these last several years, they're just not going to abide by the Treasury Department's dictates. And so it's a losing strategy, but of course the U.S. is committed to several losing strategies.
All right, Connor, let's shift gears here and talk about some news from Gaza before we wrap up. I got a couple articles that I actually wrote just before we recorded here. UN forced to halt aid deliveries into Gaza, and then the organization warns of immediate starvation. The UN said that it was no longer able to continue aid deliveries into Gaza as an Israeli fuel blockade of the enclave has led to widespread communications blackouts. The World Health Organization warned that ending the aid deliveries means the immediate possible starvation of the 2.3 million people in Gaza. The United Nations Relief and Workers Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, that's UNRWA, announced on Friday that it was forced to halt aid shipments into Gaza. And this is from the agency's social media account. The communications network in Gaza is down because there is no fuel. This makes it impossible to manage or coordinate humanitarian aid convoys. The Commissioner General of the group, Felipe Lazzarani, slammed Tel Aviv for causing a humanitarian crisis. I do not believe there is a deliberate attempt to strangle our operation and paralyze the UNRWA operation. For weeks on end, we have pleaded, warning about the impact and the lack of fuel. On Thursday, Gaza's telecommunication companies said they were completely out of fuel to run their networks. On Wednesday, Human Rights Watch issued a report saying that if fuel was not allowed into Gaza, a communications blackout would occur. The group warned that prolonged and complete communications blackouts like those experienced in Gaza can provide cover for atrocities and breed impunity while further undermining humanitarian efforts and putting lives at risk. Israel said it agreed to allow 2 fuel trucks into Gaza on Friday. However, UNRWA officials stated, "I can confirm that our organization did not receive any fuel on Friday." Even if Tel Aviv promises with its through on its allowance of fuel into Gaza, Larzani says that it will be an insufficient amount for his agency to even maintain basic operations. Most of the fuel that Tel Aviv will allow to enter Gaza will go to run the trucks that haul aid from southern Israel, where it must pass an inspection, through Egypt and into Gaza through the Rafah crossing. Some Western countries have become frustrated with Tel Aviv's refusal to allow aid to cross from Israel to Gaza. Israel's inspections regime has caused a backup and delay of aid shipments. The UN World Food Program, that's the WFP, said civilians face the immediate possibility of starvation due to the lack of food supplies. The group's director said that there is almost no food or water in Gaza. Executive Director Cindy McCain expressed that supplies of food and water are practically non-existent. She noted that that even before aid was halted, it was only a fraction of what is needed arriving through the borders. She added that with winter fast approaching, unsafe and overcrowded shelters, and a lack of clean water, civilians are facing the immediate possibility of starvation. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza has only gotten worse, as Israel has signaled it will push its forces into the southern half of the besieged enclave. Tel Aviv's military operations have already displaced 1.5 million people and killed 11,000, wounding tens of thousands of others. I think that number now is at 30,000. As the assault enters its 6th week, Palestinians continue to die because of a lack of food, water, and will begin to die from a lack of food, water, and medical aid. UNRWA estimates that around 70% of the population in Gaza is drinking salinized and contaminated water. Hospitals in Gaza report babies are dying as there is no drinking water to produce formula. And the head of plastic surgery at the Al-Shifa Hospital explained that most intensive care patients who were on ventilators have now died due to a lack of oxygen and fuel. All right, Connor, one more article here today. Netanyahu claims that Israel is not successful in minimizing civilian casualties. And if you believe it or not, I think this statement by Netanyahu is actually pro-Israel propaganda here. So he says that Israel is trying to minimize civilian casualties, but unfortunately, we are not successful. The Prime Minister's statement comes as the UN warns that the Israeli fuel embargo of Gaza could cause widespread starvation in the besieged enclave. In an interview with CBS News on Thursday, the Israeli Prime Minister said that Tel Aviv was trying to wipe out Hamas with minimal civilian casualties. He stated, "That's what we're trying to do, minimum civilian casualties, but unfortunately, we are not succeeding." Netanyahu went on to blame Hamas for the high civilian toll in Gaza. "Any civilian death is a tragedy, and we shouldn't have any because we're doing everything we can to get civilians out of harm's way, while Hamas is doing everything they can to keep them in harm's way," he argued. The Israeli leader said his forces had taken steps to warn civilians of upcoming strikes. "So we send leaflets, we call them on their cell phones, and we say leave, and many have left," Netanyahu said. In the first weeks of the Israeli military campaign, Tel Aviv instructed Gazans to move to the southern half of the Strip. Palestinians who fled their homes have been killed while trying to evacuate. Some Gaza residents have been unable to locate basic resources after fleeing and were forced to return to their homes. On Wednesday, Israel began instructing Palestinians in southern Gaza to evacuate. It is unclear where people are supposed to go next. Since Israel has started bombing Gaza 6 weeks ago, at least 11,000 civilians, including 4,500 children, have been killed. The UN reports that 1 in every 57 people living in the Gaza Strip have been injured or killed or wounded. Dozens of journalists and doctors are among the dead. Over 100 UN staff members have been killed. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, told the UN Security Council that the Israeli bombing and invasion of Gaza has decimated the healthcare infrastructure. The World Health Organization has recorded at least 137 attacks on healthcare in Gaza. With especially severe impacts on Al-Shifa Hospital in recent days, where newborns on life support are dying due to power, oxygen, and water cuts, while many other patients of all ages are at risk, as well as medics and other people sheltering on hospital grounds, he said. Netanyahu attempted to justify the 2-day raid on the Shifa hospital by claiming that he believed Israel would find hostages in the facility and Hamas was using the building as a headquarters. He told CBS News there were strong indications that Israeli hostages were being held there, and this was one of the reasons we entered. However, Connor, surprisingly, I guess, none were found. Now, I will say, it may be possible that one of the hostages ended up at a hospital at some point in Gaza because they needed a level of medical care that Hamas was unable to provide in whatever shelter or bunker that they're using. And so, if Netanyahu says, aha, there was a hostage here at one point, that's really not proof that this is some massive holding, cell for the hostages and deserves to be a military target or anything like that. But they didn't even turn up that, Connor. So I guess I'm probably giving just Tel Aviv too much credit. The Israeli Prime Minister went on to say that Tel Aviv had, quote, concrete evidence that there were terrorists, chieftains, and terrorists in the hospital. But Netanyahu says they fled as the Israeli forces entered, so they couldn't find any. Israeli forces who entered Shifa found a small number of guns and uniforms, and I talked about in the last episode of the show, so I'm not going to get into too much of it today. And then just to wrap up here, after a Hamas attack in southern Israel on October 7th, Tel Aviv cut off food, water aid, and fuel into Gaza. The Israeli government has relaxed the embargo to allow small amounts of food and water into the besieged enclave. However, the lack of fuel has now completely halted aid shipments, while Netanyahu is attempting to take the moral path and save the lives of Palestinians when possible. The international aid agencies are now warning there is a risk of massive starvation in Gaza. And so, Connor, this statement by Netanyahu, his government, his forces have committed so many atrocities. The only believable thing they could possibly say is, yeah, we're killing a lot of civilians, but we're trying not to. If they said they weren't killing civilians, nobody would believe it, because there is a massive pile of dead babies in Gaza. And you just, no matter how much people hate Hamas, you can't look at something that's over 2 feet long and pretend that that could possibly kill any Israeli, right? And so when you have dead babies, like just little babies, you have to admit that you're killing civilians. And that's what Netanyahu is doing here, but he's trying to pin all the blame on Hamas and then to say, oh, we're really trying. So this is just some really terrible and disgusting propaganda. And with that, Connor, I'm going to let you give us some more news on the situation in Israel.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, it's more part and parcel with all of this. And poor little Israel is just defending itself, but has to kill thousands of women and children to do it, and babies as well. And so, they don't want Netanyahu, of course, as is his MO, is attempting to take the moral path. But again, this flies in the face of reality. So that gets to this next story. Displacement and killing surge in West Bank amid Gaza war. And so I wrote this for antiwar.com last night. It's largely based off of this great piece in Times of Israel that I encourage everybody to read. They got a lot of great quotes and data here from various human rights organizations, including Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem and Peace Now. And I tried to find the original sourcing on the quotes that they were getting from these human rights organizations. I think the original. I believe that the Times of Israel is publishing this stuff themselves. So it's a very important article. I'm sure it'll work its way into future reports from the organizations, but it sounds like Times of Israel is reporting the latest here by going straight to the source. And so a wave of murders, violence, and harassment waged against Palestinians has been unleashed by the Israeli Defense Forces and illegal settlers alike in the occupied West Bank, according to the Times of Israel. Nearly 200 Palestinians have been killed, including 48 children in the West Bank, since Tel Aviv's massive bombing campaign against the besieged Gaza Strip was launched last month. B'Tselem, the premier human rights organization, by the way, there's more than 200 Palestinians have been killed so far in the West Bank since the 7th, but we'll get to that in the next story. B'Tselem, the premier Israeli human rights organization, reports that since the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, 963 Palestinians have been displaced in these rampant attacks. So the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OSHA, estimates the number of people forced from their homes and villages is actually even higher. OSHA notes that about 1,150 Palestinians from 15 herding communities have been uprooted by repressive movement restrictions imposed on Palestinians in the West Bank, as well as the settler violence. Entire villages such as Rodhem and Zanuta have been depopulated over the last month as well. In that same time, the Yesh Din organization estimates that there have been in excess of 185 attacks by settlers against Palestinians in more than 84 villages and towns. Times of Israel reports that in the wake of the current war, illegal West Bank settlers, as we've been covering the last couple of weeks, particularly that piece from Haaretz, these illegal West Bank settlers are being recruited by the army into 6 so-called regional defensive battalions. So as the line between settlers and the military is obscured, violent attacks have escalated. So earlier this month, Haaretz reported that some of the settlers being inducted into these new army militias ostensibly formed to defend ultra-Orthodox illegal Jewish-only colonies in the West Bank may have criminal records. That was a big part of the article, is saying that some of these guys, it depends on what they were charged with and what they were convicted for. But in other words, a criminal record will not necessarily preclude these settlers from joining these militias that are created by the army. And so by Israel's apartheid army. And so, for example, these attacks that are ramping up. You have in the village of Susya a Palestinian shepherd named Ahmad Jabra Nawaja. He was, and I'm not getting into all the details here in my article here, but it's pretty disgusting when you read the article. Times of Israel interviewed this man. He was brutally beaten in the middle of the night at 4 a.m. After a previous confrontation where masked up settlers in IDF uniforms showed up with M16 rifles and started making threats and pointing guns at his daughters. They're sleeping in their agricultural truck because they're worried that the settlers are going to invade their home in the middle of the night and set it on fire with all the chaos that's been going on in the West Bank. And so it didn't matter. They pulled him out of his truck and then brutally beat him in front of his wife and daughters. And his daughters, one of them, threw up from fear and just terror of the whole experience. He was threatened with death during the attack by the masked men with the M16s. They warned him that if he wouldn't destroy the structures on his own property himself and leave his land, that they're going to come back and kill him. So he says, when they put the gun to my neck, I was terrified. I thought he was going to shoot me. I thought it was over. My heart was beating like crazy, Nawaja told the outlet. He says such incidents are just the new reality in the West Bank, lamenting we have nowhere else to go. We don't have any alternative. And now, additionally, deliberate destruction, and they get into this quite a bit. There's been deliberate destruction and sabotage of water tanks in Palestinian villages, as well as solar panels, which were all critical for daily life for these villagers. This is according to Beth Selim. They're doing the work on this. And so, for instance, in Susya's same village, 3 water cisterns were severely damaged and rendered unusable after a man believed to be a settler using a tractor pushed so much rubble into them under supervision of armed IDF soldiers, of course, that they were destroyed, that they don't work anymore. And so in a response to questions regarding the demolition, the Israeli army spokesperson's unit stated, and this quote is in the article too, IDF forces that came to Susya to carry out an engineering operation on October 16 exceeded the boundaries of the actions that had been defined due to lack of coordination. So this is the kind of Orwellian nonsense and just absolute callousness against the civilian population that the Palestinians are subjected to under this apartheid regime. So Peace Now, the Israeli activist group, has explained that Israel's bombing campaign and ground invasion in Gaza, which has killed over 11,000 Palestinians, is probably thousands more buried under the rubble here, and who we're not going to find out about for much longer, since they've been cutting off the fuel, and so many of the hospitals are completely inoperable now. And along with the tensions at the northern border with Hezbollah, so you have all these soldiers that are being pulled over to either the north or the south. And so they're basically recruiting settlers to make up the difference in the West Bank, which is only going to lead to more and more violence, more killings, more dispossession, more attacks against the civilians there. So Peace Now says this has created a new reality where the security system in the West Bank increasingly relies on settlers within the framework of operational activities, becoming more dependent on them. The group adds that ideological and violent settlers leverage the war to coerce the military for their own goals of expulsion and harm to Palestinians. And I think we're seeing, in that article we talked about last week with Bezalel Smotrich, who has the, he's the extremist settler who has he's not only the finance minister, and the head of the religious Zionism party, but he also has a special position that they created for him in the defense ministry, where he's effectively the governor of the occupied territories. So he's in charge of home demolitions. And of course, he's so ideologically committed to annexing the West Bank that, it's one of the reasons why they've set records for settlement construction all year. And not to mention the fact that there was already one of the bloodiest years for Palestinians on record as well. It's been brutal in the West Bank all year, and it's only gotten so much worse since the war started in Gaza. And so he's talking about, like we discussed last week, setting up these barriers around settlements that are going to block off Palestinians from even more of their land, including during the olive harvest season. There's not going to be any exceptions made. So it's just taking more land and dispossessing the Palestinians continuously. So it's not just the settlers; it's the settlers and the government as well, like Itamar Ben-Gvir as well. So. As I mentioned before, settlers have murdered olive harvesters and then even killed people attending their funerals. Now, OSHA says that since the October 7th attack, Hamas's attack on Israel and the war on Gaza began, settler attacks on Palestinians have more than doubled. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the extremist settler and Israel's national security minister, announced last month that Tel Aviv is purchasing and distributing 10,000 assault rifles to Israeli citizens, including within the West Bank's legal settlements. And now, according to Axios, the State Department is set to approve a $34 million sale of 24,000 M16 semi-automatic and automatic rifles. So these are rifles that some of which are illegal in the U.S. After reportedly receiving dubious assurances from Tel Aviv that the weapons will not be provided to settlers. If you believe that Itamar Ben-Gvir is going to abide by those promises to the Biden administration, I think I could sell a bridge to you too. But concurrently, per the Palestinian Prisoners Society, almost 2,200 and 800 Palestinians have been rounded up by the Israeli security forces since October 7th, as a huge arrest campaign has been ongoing in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And they've, of course, attacked protests and killed people at protests as well. Against the war that are ongoing in the West Bank. And as Kyle, as you've pointed out in your great interview recently on the Scott Horton show, a big point of contention already, one of the reasons why Hamas took prisoners in the first place was not only to gain concessions regarding the siege on Gaza and the horrible humanitarian situation that existed before the war began and has existed since the siege was imposed and all the subsequent bombing campaigns against the civilians there, but also because there's thousands of Palestinian prisoners locked up by the Israelis that amount to essentially political prisoners. And many of them are just protesters and peace activists, and maybe some kids who threw some stones at occupying forces that they've been, brutalized by their whole lives. And so, this is just adding more and more fuel to the fire, of course. And so so this has been going in the East Jerusalem and the West Bank. They're rounding up all these people. It's getting close to 3,000 prisoners now since the 7th. Middle East Eye reports that the compiled figures include arrests made from homes, military checkpoints, and Palestinians forced into submission, quote, under pressure by Israeli forces. So although the war on Gaza is making all the headlines because of the thousands of women and children that Israel is slaughtering, the West Bank is now receiving more international attention, thankfully. So we have a quote here from Anne-Claire Legendre, spokesperson for the French Foreign Ministry. She told a press conference yesterday, I believe, that concerning the West Bank, I'd like to express the strongest condemnation by France of the violence carried out by the settlers against the Palestinians. Violence which has the clear objective of forced displacement of the Palestinians and a policy of terror. Now, Volker Turk, who you mentioned earlier, Kyle, the United Nations human rights chief, admonished that, quote, the intensification of violence and severe discrimination against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, creates a potentially explosive situation. He emphasized, I am ringing the loudest possible alarm bell regarding the deteriorating situation in the West Bank. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's very important to mention this always because, the corporate press wants us to believe, and the Zionists and the right-wingers and the administration want us to think that history started on the 7th. For Palestinians, prior to October, this year was already one of the deadliest on record. Before the end of September, more than 220 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces and settlers, including over 36 children. That figure includes 187 people who were murdered in the occupied territories and another 37 killed, mostly amidst a smaller bombing campaign in the Gaza Strip. Okay. Now, this came out today, at Al Jazeera. Israeli forces raid Jenin, the refugee camp, which they've raided multiple times this year, killed several people, including a dozen in a brutal attack earlier in July, where they used bulldozers to tear up the They tore up the roads and the water and electricity networks. They sent in 150 armored vehicles, about 1,000 troops, Apache helicopters, drones. They, carried out airstrikes on the camp, and they did that again today. And in the raid that began last night. And that was setting a big precedent in July, because an airstrike like that had not been carried out in the West Bank, I believe, for 15 years or more. And so again, we're just continuing with this policy. Israeli forces raid Jenin, surround Ibn Sina Hospital, and occupy West Bank. So now they're not just invading and shelling and raiding and attacking hospitals in Gaza. They're now attacking hospitals in the West Bank. So here from the piece, at least 3 killed in drone strike on the Jenin refugee camp as dozens of Israeli tanks push into the city. A number of hospitals were surrounded and at least 3 people were killed as Israeli forces launched a major raid on Jenin in the occupied West Bank. The attacks, launched overnight and lasting into Friday, also left 14 others injured, according to Palestinian sources. The raid ended after several hours. A drone strike on the Jenin refugee camp is what killed the 3 people. Now, the Palestinian ambulance service says that the Israeli army killed 5. The Palestinian ambulance service says that 3 people were killed at least, but the Israeli army says that 5 were killed. Airstrikes have become more regular in the West Bank as the war in Gaza rages on. Emergency services were prevented by Israeli forces from reaching the injured, potentially placing lives at risk, and that was reported by the official Palestinian news agency Wafa. So from 10:30 p.m. on Thursday evening, the Israeli army pushed at least 80 military vehicles into the city of Jenin, raiding Palestinian homes and detaining several people. And there were reports of violent clashes, of course. This is Al Jazeera's Sarah Kiharet from occupied East Jerusalem. She says dozens of armored vehicles turned up with bulldozers as well, damaging cars, damaging the roads. The raid lasted for about 8 hours. At least 4 hospitals were surrounded by Israeli soldiers, including the Ibn Sina Hospital. Israeli forces, she says, turned up at the Ibn Sina Hospital, one of the biggest in the occupied West Bank. They turned up in a raid where they asked medical staff to put their hands up and evacuate the hospital. A number of doctors from the hospital refused to comply and evacuate, so 2 paramedics were arrested, she added. It is important, she says, to note that this happened in the Jenin refugee camp, where clashes have been intense almost daily. But the nature of this particular raid is quite incredible, really. No, not just it being a hospital, but the way the Israeli forces are coming in. So the Israeli military said that it had exchanged fire with Palestinian fighters, who then used ambulances to flee towards the Ibn Sina hospital, quote, in order to hide there. 1 Palestinian fighter was arrested at the entrance of the medical facility, the army said. Tensions have been high across the West Bank since Israel launched its war on Hamas on October 7th, which has killed 11,500 people in the Gaza Strip, as far as we know. For now, that's the best estimate, because as we say, you have thousands more buried under rubble and the healthcare system is crumbling. And so Israeli forces arrested 47 Palestinians in the West Bank overnight. The Commission for Prisoners and Ex-Detainees Affairs said on Friday 26 of the arrests were in Ne'lin, west of Ramallah. At a checkpoint north of Hebron, there was a shootout between Palestinian fighters and Israeli troops on Friday, in which 2 Palestinians were killed, said Al Jazeera's Zain Basravi, reporting from Ramallah. And on Thursday, 3 Palestinians were shot dead by Israeli soldiers after opening fire at another checkpoint in the West Bank. 1 Israeli soldier was killed in that attack, according to Israeli officials. Now, Basravi said that such attacks using small arms and explosives have increased in recent weeks amid mounting anger over civilian deaths in Gaza and the occupation of the West Bank. Quote, as Israel continues to turn up the heat, turn up the pressure on Palestinian communities, people are beginning to push back, he said. So since October 7th, 203 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli raids in the West Bank. All right. Now moving to Syria. Israel bombed Syria. So this is from the Cradle, November 17th, and this was reported today. So in the early hours of Friday, November 17th, you have Syrian air defense systems repelling a missile attack by Israel, which targeted multiple points in Damascus during the early hours of November 17th. So a military source told Syrian Arab news agency Sana that, quote, around 2:25 a.m. Friday, the Israeli enemy carried out an aerial attack from the direction of the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, targeting a number of points in the surroundings of Damascus. Quote, the Army Air Defense Forces responded to the missile aggression and shot down most of them, saying the damage was limited to materials. So just material damage, the state-run news outlet added. So the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reports that the attacks, and they're pro-opposition, they report that against Damascus, they report that the attacks that happened in the vicinity of the shrine of, I hope probably not going to pronounce this right, Sayyida Zainab, were allegedly targeting a weapons cache depot belonging to Hezbollah. Now, Friday's airstrikes come 8 days after the previous Israeli attack on Syria, and there have been well over 30 airstrikes on Syria this year. And they've been ramped up since the war, of course. So, since the war began. So, Syria has another front. Has been another front to the increasingly escalating Al-Aqsa flood operation by the Palestinian resistance against Israel. Now, Lebanon's Hezbollah, Yemen, the Houthis, and the Iraqi resistance forces operating the Shiite militias in Syria and in Iraq have been making moves against Israel in solidarity with Palestinian resistance groups as Israel continues its brutal ethnic cleansing campaign on Gaza. And this is, especially with the Shiite militias, we're talking about attacks on U.S. bases who were, still occupying a third of Syria, largely at the behest of Tel Aviv. And so, besides alleged military sites and weapons caches that Israel claims the attacks are aimed towards, the article says Tel Aviv has also launched multiple attacks on Damascus and Aleppo international airports, shutting down operations for days at a time. I believe they've attacked the Aleppo International Airport just since the war began 3 or 4 times. And I believe Damascus has been targeted. The Damascus International Airport has been targeted twice. It's hard to keep track, and they bombed them multiple times this year. And so, including after that horrible earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria in February. Just another callous measure by the Israelis just to cut off aid that was flowing through the Aleppo International Airport to help these poor people. So now this last story, is about the Iranians and these back channel talks they're having with the Americans. So this is again from the Cradle, based on a piece in Financial Times. And this is from the 17th as well. So it's called Tehran to Washington. We do not want Gaza-Israel war to escalate. So Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian spoke with Financial Times on the 16th from Geneva and revealed that back-channel communications with the U.S. have been active since the start of the Gaza-Israel war. So he says, over the past 40 days, messages have been exchanged between Israel and the U.S. via the U.S. interest section at the Swiss embassy in Tehran. We said that Iran does not want the war to spread, but due to the approach adopted by the U.S. and Israel in the region, if the crimes against the people of Gaza and the West Bank are not stopped, any possibility could be considered and a wider conflict could prove inevitable, Amir Abdollahian revealed. According to the newspaper, the British newspaper, he ruled out the possibility of direct talks between Tehran and Washington. He also accused the U.S. of inviting Tehran, quote, to exercise restraint while it was itself escalating the war in Gaza. Quote, our military officials are of the opinion that the deployment of U.S. aircraft carriers near our region, which makes them accessible, is not a strong point for the U.S. Rather, it makes them more vulnerable to possible strikes, Amir Abdollahian said. The war has already expanded in the region, he added. The fact that the Yemeni army attacks the occupied lands with missiles and drones means the war has begun to expand. The fact that Hezbollah is fighting with a third of the Israeli army shows the war has expanded. He stressed that factions within the resistance axis, including Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the Islamic resistance in Iraq, are not Iranian proxies and have, quote, an independent political identity. However, he warned that these groups, quote, are not indifferent towards the killing of their Muslim and Arab peers in Palestine. Commenting on U.S. airstrikes on alleged Iranian positions in Syria, Amir Abdollahian denied the Pentagon's claims, saying that, quote, no Iranian forces were struck. They always have to paint everything as, well, these are sites used by the IRGC and affiliated groups, so that, and as they said, they will admit, as you can see their stories in Reuters and elsewhere, that they don't have any evidence that Iran is directing these attacks against American bases, as if these Shiite militiamen, as he's saying, in the resistance axis need any extra impetus or push from the Iranians to attack the Americans occupying their lands and funding and overseeing and underwriting a what it amounts to and what is viewed as a genocide, ethnic cleansing, a brutal ethnic cleansing campaign, massive bombing campaign, piling up thousands of bodies, as you say, corpses of women and children, as if they need any extra push from the Iranians to go ahead and do that. This has been going on before Israel was blowing apart women and children with American bombs and American warplanes since October 7th. They were already attacking American bases, and we heard Milley earlier this year threaten that, we're going to start attacking the IRGC harshly. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff threatening to start a war with Iran over our illegal occupation in Syria. And so, I just think that that's a fair point, because we have to assume that everything is either some Hezbollah arms shipment, which I don't deny that that's actually going on. That's, maybe coming from Iran and it's making its way through Syria. But so what? Israel doesn't have the right to bomb Syria whenever they want. And of course, we know that they're bombing civilian infrastructure and killing civilians and killing members of the Syrian Arab Army in many of these attacks. So that's, on its face, it's just ridiculous. So the Iranian and that's just the Israelis. But the Americans, again, it's difficult to get clear information about who they're killing in eastern Syria when they launch these strikes. But to just paint it all as like, Iran is frankly already just dangerous, and let alone they don't prove these points that they're making. Although they have said, it was a Pentagon official, I believe, that told Reuters that they have killed people in these strikes that have, I believe in the last airstrikes that the U.S. carried out in Syria, they claimed that they killed, I think, 7 people, which is a huge escalation. And so the Iranian foreign minister also revealed that the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, quote, never asked Iran to enter the war. Quote, they have everything and they produce missiles and drones themselves. Palestinian resistance groups have the capability to produce the military equipment they need inside Palestine. It is now time for a face-to-face confrontation between the Palestinian resistance groups and Israeli forces. This is what the resistance groups have been waiting for weeks. I can say clearly, considering the knowledge we have and following meetings with leaders in the region, that the fate of this war will be determined by resistance groups, not Israel, Amir Abdollahian stressed. I think, he's not, I don't think he's likely to say anything to the contrary for political reasons. And I think that Hamas actually puts up a good fight on the ground against the Israelis. But of course, that's besides the point. We're talking about over 10,000 civilians that have likely been killed. I know we're not getting firm numbers on how many of these people are fighters, but I think it's important. I believe that story was in the Times or the Post, where we heard from a Pentagon official that Israel has not, as far as the Americans know, has not made a dent in even the middle leadership ranks of Hamas. So this war is not about killing members of Hamas or damaging Hamas or eradicating Hamas based on the actions of the Israeli forces. It looks to be an ethnic cleansing campaign, and they're laying the political groundwork in various ways to get at least especially the Americans and broadly the West to accept that, with these the article, of course, that Danny Danon and that member of Yair Lapid, the former prime minister's opposition party, put in the Wall Street Journal recently, where they're encouraging, you have an obligation, the Western world, to take these refugees, and of course pushing Egypt to take refugees as well and to participate in this brutal campaign to just basically push all the Palestinians out of Gaza so the settlers can come back in and they can take that land all for themselves again.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for the update. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show, and we'll be back with more episodes next week.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.